In Mississippi in the year 1861, the South was already unraveling. War had not yet reached the fields, but famine and suspicion had already taken root. On the banks of the river stood a farmhouse where one evening 11 members of a single family sat down together for supper. By morning, every one of them was gone. Their bowls still sat half-filled spoons resting where hands had fallen. No sign of struggle, no cry for help, only silence, and only one living witness remained, the cook who had served the meal. She never explained what happened. She never needed to. Parish records would mark that family with a single entry. All 11 gone on the same day. Their causes of death crossed out in heavy ink. The kitchen was sealed behind a wall of brick. The house abandoned. And the table, the same table where they died, would drift from one unwilling owner to the next, carrying with it a shadow that no one could scrub away. This is not a story of war nor of hunger. It is the story of something that moved unseen, traveling from spoon to swallow, erasing a family in an instant, and of the one survivor who left behind only 7 words: "I was told to serve and I served." Where are you listening from? And what hour of night or morning do you find yourself here? Share it in the comments and subscribe to the 7th Mark so that stories like this one, stories of those erased, are not forgotten. The farmhouse stood on the edge of a field that no plow had touched in years. Its shutters were drawn tight against a heat that lingered long after the sun had gone down. When, at last, a neighbor forced the door open, expecting perhaps the sound of children or the restless quiet of a family asleep, he found something altogether different. The house did not breathe. Its silence was the silence of a wound. In the dining room, a long table stretched beneath a chandelier gone dark. Every place had been set. Bowls stood waiting, filled halfway with broth. Spoons rested as though dropped mid-motion. Cuts of meat still held their form, though the fat had begun to harden into a pale film. 11 chairs stood pulled back from the table, at strange angles, as if their occupants had risen suddenly or never risen at all. Only one chair remained perfectly aligned with the table. Its plate was untouched. The air inside was stale, thick, and strange. Decades later, that first neighbor would struggle to describe what he smelled. It was not rot, not yet. It was something worse. The odor of food abandoned in the very act of being eaten mingled with the heat of the Mississippi summer. The scent clung to the curtains, to the wood, to the air itself. He lingered at the threshold, unable to move closer. The sight of spoons frozen in bowls suggested not just death, but interruption, as though motion itself had been severed. The walls gave no answer. No overturned chairs, no stains of violence. Only silence heavy enough to make the air itself feel wrong. Later neighbors would recall his words. It was as though the table waited for them to return. His testimony noted the faint scuff marks beneath the chairs, the ghostly outlines of where each pair of shoes had once pressed against the floor. Yet, what lingered was not a family away, nor a family asleep. It was the impression of something absolute, a family erased. Between spoon and swallow, the untouched chair became a detail that haunted every retelling. Some whispered it belonged to the eldest son absent that night. Others claimed it was set for a guest who never came. Parish notes offered no clarification recording, only that one place had been left vacant. In local memory, That chair became the silent witness, the hollow presence among 11 vanished voices. Outside, the night had carried on as always. Insects hummed in the fields. The river flowed without pause. But inside that dining room, time had fractured. The food itself seemed suspended between life and decay. Broth congealed but not spoiled bread, stiff but unbitten. A meal that could not be finished. For hours, the house stood unmarked until others were called. But from that first moment, the mystery was never one of famine nor of neglect. The evidence was too sudden, too precise, too complete. The house had been alive with the sound of a family at supper, and then all at once it was emptied. What remained was the table still set, still holding the weight of a meal no one would ever finish. And in that stillness, the first suspicion began to take root. This was not simply death, it was arrangement. It was staging. It was something meant to be read like a sentence left unfinished in the middle of a page. In Mississippi of the mid-19th century, the parish ledger was more than a book of names. It was scripture law and memory bound in ink. Every baptism, every union, every burial was carried through the minister's hand, written in a line that gave permanence to lives long after bodies had gone to earth. To enter a name was to preserve it. To deny detail was to bury it twice. When researchers turned to the 1861 volume, its pages stiff with age, they found an entry that broke that order. 11 names, one after another, entered on the same day. The family recorded as if felled by a single stroke of fate. Yet the column, where causes of death were always inscribed fever war decline, was instead filled with nothing but black ink. Not words, not even symbols, just heavy lines driven so deep they bled through to the reverse, making the paper stiff as though scorched. The surrounding entries were clear, measured, consistent in the hand of the clerk. But here his pen had stopped its careful rhythm. What appeared on the page was not record-keeping. It was something closer to burial, an act of erasure written as punishment. Tradition dictated that some explanation always followed a death. Even vague phrases like weakness or sudden turn had their place. But for this family, nothing. 11 names and then silence forced upon the paper. The absence itself spoke louder than any word could have. Scholars remind us that ledgers were not only religious tools, but legal ones. Property inheritance disputes between families, all of it rested on their accuracy. To strike out cause was not omission. It was obstruction. It was denial. Without a cause, no court could compel inquiry, no neighbor could contest claim. The act itself was a mechanism by which memory was made into silence. Some who later examined the document believed the ink was pressed so heavily not only to obscure, but to seal, to lock away. The strokes layered dark upon dark until the fibers of the page warped. Around those 11 lines, other names breathed births, baptisms, marriages, deaths. But these remained suffocated, smothered beneath ink. A family transformed into shadows by a pen held too long. No one knows who ordered it. Clergy stood as both shepherds of souls and arbiters of earthly order. They carried the power to shield households from scandal when instructed to do so. Madness, poison, heresy. Any of it could be softened, concealed, dissolved with ink. The church served heaven, yes, but it also served families who had much to lose. And so the next entry turned the page as if nothing had happened. Births resumed. Marriages filled the lines. Deaths marked with ordinary explanations. The ledger's pulse returned to rhythm, but the void remained visible even to the untrained eye. A line of history excised not by time, but by human hand. That contrast, the neatness of the book surrounding a silence so deliberate, is what unsettles readers even now. A ledger is not supposed to whisper in silence. When it does, when 11 names are swallowed in ink, it feels less like accident than warning. Beneath glass in the parish archive, those brittle pages still rest. The names are preserved, but unreadable, smothered by the same strokes meant to protect or to conceal. What was meant to explain their passing now guards it in secrecy. And so for many, the ledger itself became the first suspect. Not the cook, not the table, not even the food, but the page. Among those seated that night, one remained outside their fate. The cook. A woman whose name appears once in census records that year and then vanishes. She was not found collapsed at the table. Her plate bore no sign of use. She had served. She had stood apart. And when questioned, she spoke only once. I was told to serve, and I served. That sentence, preserved in testimony, outlived her. Neighbors remembered her posture sitting quietly at the end of the table, hands folded, refusing to eat. Some said she seemed to wait for instruction. Others swore she looked more like a witness than a participant, a figure set apart. Whatever her role, she lived, while every other place fell silent. Census rolls listed her as enslaved, tied to the family by law. After the deaths, her name disappeared. No property transfer carried her forward. No burial, no marriage, no purchase. She walked out of the record as abruptly as she had entered it. Witness reports, sparse, fragmented, describe her silence as unbreakable. She did not answer neighbors. She did not speak to the officials who arrived days later. She gave the world only one sentence and then was gone. The only preserved line of testimony, written into parish notes, was simple. She had served when instructed and nothing more. No defense, no explanation. Just a statement of duty bound, tight as if her whole existence could be reduced to obedience. Psychologists reading from centuries away have tried to interpret that silence, though the distance makes certainty impossible. Some insist it suggests complicity, that she had knowledge, perhaps motive, and chose to withhold it. Others argue the opposite, that she was never permitted to speak truth, bound beneath the same system that reduced her to a line of property, a name struck once and then discarded when no longer useful. What remains certain is that her silence amplified the mystery. To witnesses, it became either shield or confession. The fact that she alone survived untouched, unshaken, remains perhaps the most unsettling detail. If poison had been involved, why did it not reach her? If sudden illness had struck, why did it pass her by? Her survival placed her squarely at the center of suspicion, and yet, because she gave no further words, suspicion found nothing to seize. Later researchers noted the precision of her disappearance. She does not appear in burial notes, nor in medical accounts, nor in the slave schedules that survived past emancipation. It is as though her survival erased her from every subsequent document, as though history itself had chosen to silence her. The cook lived through the supper, but her life after it was buried in the same void that swallowed the family's cause of death. The line she left, "I was told to serve," and "I served" has become folklore, repeated as both confession and condemnation. To some, it reads as obedience. To others, it carries a finality that closes all inquiry, a statement that shields her behind duty. Was it the faithfulness of a woman who had done what she was ordered, or the calculated silence of one who knew her only safety lay in words left unsaid? Her survival was not an answer. It was another question suspended between guilt and innocence. If the meal bore death, she carried none of it. If the family was silenced, she remained the only voice and chose not to use it. The ledger holds her name once, then nothing. The farmhouse bore her presence for one night and then lost her forever. The mystery only deepened. 11 bowls stood on the table. Only one pair of eyes survived to see them emptied. Mississippi, 1861. The year began with fields still alive, but by autumn, the land had fallen into a silence of its own. War crept closer. The fertile earth, which had once promised security, became a stage for dread. Farmers who had relied on the steady rhythm of planting and harvest now faced shortages, broken trade, and a climate of suspicion, stretching neighbor to neighbor. The air carried more than heat. It carried fear. Blockades loomed. River traffic slowed. Ports grew tense. Families that had once feasted on cornmeal pork and molasses now measured rations carefully. Crops failed under irregular skies. Fields lay abandoned as men marched to war. Those who remained hoarded what they had, sealing jars and guarding barrels against a future no one trusted would arrive intact. It was within this atmosphere that the family at the farmhouse lived. Parish inventories marked them as unusually well supplied, preserved meats, grain barrels of salt. Such abundance in a year of want made them not only fortunate, but targets. Across Mississippi, whispers of theft circled endlessly. To lose food was to lose survival, and theft was spoken of with the gravity of murder. Against this backdrop, the old fear of poisoning flared. In county records from that year, families refused meals prepared by servants. Mothers tasted food before allowing their children to eat. Strangers were accused of slipping powders into kettles. In a time when every bite mattered, rumor itself was deadly enough. The deaths at the farmhouse then did not exist in isolation. They unfolded against a year already defined by hunger and suspicion. Families ate together with the knowledge that every mouthful was both necessary and dangerous. That 11 members of a single household should perish at one table struck observers as both shocking and strangely fitting. A collapse staged precisely where the year's fears were most concentrated in the act of eating. Even preservation itself carried dread. Salted pork spoiled in barrels. Beans sprouted mold. Cornmeal grew insects in the dark. Where famine pressed close, ordinary decay was read as sabotage. To consume food was to gamble not only with health, but with betrayal. Every household guarded its larder. Neighbors who once shared now watched one another with suspicion. So when the family was found lifeless at their supper, the event was not read as a private catastrophe. It was absorbed into the larger story of 1861. Some whispered that they had been targeted for their stores. Others said it was retribution punishment for hoarding, while others starved. In a year remembered for empty fields and locked pantries, the silence of that table appeared less like a mystery and more like culmination. Yet, the details never fit such tidy explanations. If theft had truly been the motive, why had the provisions been left untouched? Shelves, still lined bins, still full. And if famine had pressed them towards self-destruction, why had the household cook closest to the food, most vulnerable to suspicion, been the lone survivor? Hunger sharpened unease, but did not resolve it. Instead, it deepened the conviction that what unfolded was not the ordinary result of scarcity, but something stranger, darker. The year of hunger framed the deaths, but it could not explain them. 11 lives ended in a time when survival was measured in crumbs, and yet their home remained stocked, their table still set. Scarcity had fostered fear, distrust, and the readiness to believe in poisoning. But the deaths themselves resisted neat classification. What lingered was a question that murmured beneath every explanation. Had this family been undone by the paranoia of the year, or had they quietly chosen their own end, sealing it in the silence of supper? What little is known of their final meal does not come from ledgers or official testimony, but from rumor breath carried across time, reshaped yet never forgotten. Neighbors who stepped into the house days later whispered about what they found upon the table. Their descriptions traveled from generation to generation, etched into memory with unsettling precision. The details were small, sensory, but heavy with dread. Meat recalled as too tender, broth remembered as black as ink. To grasp the weight of such accounts, one must remember the food practices of the time. In rural Mississippi of 1861, meat was preserved through salt and curing. Toughness was expected, even valued. Pork and beef softened only after hours of boiling, yielding a pale but hearty flavor. That the family's meat was remembered as tender naturally, so suggested something outside the ordinary, as though its very fibers had broken down before the pot ever touched the fire. Oral accounts compared it to flesh that yielded without resistance, a softness that disturbed rather than comforted. The broth too defied expectation. Traditional recipes produced thin liquid, often cloudy, sometimes faintly darkened by smoke or vegetables. But the family's final broth was described as black. Not dark, not rich black. Some said it looked tar-like, coating the spoon. Others swore it shimmered strangely, catching lamplight in a sheen that no soup should ever carry. None who saw it wanted to taste it. As is often the case with oral tradition, the accounts diverged. Some insisted the cook had experimented that night using unfamiliar herbs or methods. Others believed the meal had been ordinary until it reached the table, that its corruption emerged in the very act of serving. But through all variations ran a single thread: unease. Food that did not look or feel like food, served in silence, eaten despite doubt. The fragments of that night form a dim tableau, firelight flickering along the walls. The heavy smell of meat hanging in the air, clinging to fabric. The faint clatter of spoons against bowls, an ordinary sound, rendered uncanny in retrospect. 11 figures seated, trusting in sustenance, consuming what later tradition would mark as betrayal. No physical evidence endured. The food decayed within days, claimed by heat and insects before any hand could preserve it. What remained were the memories of those who entered the house afterwards, staring at bowls still half filled, spoons resting in broth too dark to be natural. Their words were never written formally, but repeated in whispers. The family had eaten something wrong, something that seemed like nourishment, but carried the taste of rot. Here the line between rumor and fact blurs. Folklore enlarges detail, turns meat into metaphor, broth into omen. Yet these fragments survived with unusual consistency. The meat's softness, the broth's blackness. They became shorthand for the night itself, tokens of a final supper, remembered less as sustenance than as a threshold. In these whispers lies the broader dread of the era. In a year steeped in scarcity and suspicion, even food became suspect. The family's last meal embodied that fear that what sustained could also destroy, that what was served in trust could mask treachery. Whether by poison, spoilage, or something more deliberate, death seemed carried in its texture and color. Oral tradition preserved enough to unsettle the taste wrong from the first spoonful. The smell heavy, the broth unnatural. The family's fate was no accident. The stories insist it was already present in the first mouthful. What unfolded in that dining room has never been told by a survivor, for none lived to speak it. Yet, the aftermath spoke in its own language. Chairs turned slightly askew, spoons dropped mid-meal, bodies slumped in place. Neighbors and parish notes agree on one improbable detail. It seemed to have happened all at once. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned chairs, no frantic clawing at the table, no slow collapse across rooms. Instead, each seat held the impression of a body sliding downward in unison. A collective surrender imprinted on wood and fabric. The meal remained unfinished, bowls still half-filled, spoons lying where hands had let them slip. Those who entered later could only imagine the sound, the soft thud of spoons falling, the last collective breath fading into silence. The sound came first, the sharp clatter of 11 spoons striking ceramic, the scrape of chairs shifting against the wooden floor, and then silence. No scream, no plea for help, only the mechanical echoes of a room suddenly emptied of life. To perish together so uniformly suggested not chaos, but simultaneity, as though an unseen signal had passed silently through them all. Neighbors summoned after the discovery spoke with careful restraint. Years later, testimony would repeat the same phrasing, a quiet collapse, bodies without struggle. Such words implied something beyond coincidence. Sudden illness could strike one, perhaps two. Contagion might spread across days, but 11 at once mid-meal with no moment for alarm. It strained belief. The parish record marked their passing on a single day, no hour, given no circumstance noted. On the page, it seemed almost ordinary clerks often omitted such details. Yet, in this case, the absence carried weight. The ledger recorded their deaths not in sequence, but together, a column of names written in one sweep of the hand, as though echoing the manner of their end. Speculation circled back again and again to the table. Poison was the whispered answer, though the speed of death made even that doubtful. Arsenic, the favored culprit of 19th century crimes, was rarely so swift. Foodborne illness brought agony, but seldom silence. The rapidity unsettled even those well acquainted with death, for it suggested a force beyond the ordinary. And if poison was present, one question refused resolution. Why had the cook survived? She had prepared the food, ladled. The broth stood closest to the table, yet she remained untouched. Did she abstain by design, withholding her own portion? Had she known and chosen silence? Or had the cause itself spared her by accident or by intent? Her survival cast the longest shadow, leaving no neutral witness, only the enigma of a woman who never spoke. Thus, the table itself became symbol. 11 people, falling not over hours, but in an instant brief enough to leave bowls, half-full spoons, still warm in broth. In a year when hunger dragged on for weeks, when disease stole life slowly, the suddenness was its own anomaly. This was not the wasting of famine or the steady fever of plague. It was something sharper, a meal interrupted by an invisible hand, decisive and final. Those who entered the house afterward recalled the uncanny stillness. Bodies slumped as though frozen mid-motion. Every spoon, every chair, every half-filled bowl bore the impression of a life cut short without warning. The strangeness was not simply that they died, but that they died as one. Death had moved through the room with singular precision, striking each place at the table, yet leaving no trace of how. When the preacher was led inside days later, he did not begin with prayer. His first words were not of comfort, but of air. In his notes, he wrote, "The odor was metallic, thick as rain. It clung to the throat and would not leave." Such descriptions were rare in 19th century accounts, where witnesses favored sight over smell. Yet here the sense of smell overwhelmed all else. The preacher claimed the room was unbreathable, the odor so dense it seemed to coat the tongue. He compared it not to rot, not to smoke, but to iron. The tang one tastes when blood touches the mouth or when rusted water runs from a pump. Later generations debated what he meant. Some suggested arsenic, though the element itself is odorless. Perhaps compounds formed in cooking, mingled with meat and broth, left a metallic tang. Others proposed mercury present in medicines and powders of the era whose vapor could poison the air. Yet the preacher's phrase, "thick as rain," implied more than a passing scent. It suggested saturation, as if the air itself had turned against its occupants. In that closed room, with broth congealing and windows shuttered, the smell was less contamination than atmosphere, a suffocation born of the very air they breathed. Iron, too, invited its own associations. Blood leaves a taste that cannot be mistaken. But no evidence of bleeding was ever noted. No stains marked the table, no violence scarred the floor. The metallic presence was sensed without cause, a phantom in the air. Testimonies clung to it as an unanswered sensation, undeniable, yet untraceable. Science at the time had little power to explain. Poisoning was a word used broadly applied alike to spoiled food, accidental herbs, and deliberate murder. Physicians could identify arsenic in lingering illness, but not in a collapse so sudden it left no chance to diagnose. Here the mystery outran the medicine of the age. The metallic odor lingered in memory, but with no preserved bodies and no samples collected, it remained speculation built on air. Yet the preacher's testimony carried unusual weight. He was a man of reputation known for guiding souls rather than spinning stories. His words were not dramatic, but methodical. Metallic, suffocating, heavy, repeated like a clinical refrain. He noted that his clothing carried the scent long after he left, and that his throat burned into the evening. Neighbors who entered later did not describe it with such precision. Some mentioned the closeness of the room, the staleness of the air, but none captured it as he had. Oral tradition, however, magnified his account. In whispered retellings, the house itself was said to breathe poison, to exhale death as though it had been soaked into the beams and floorboards. Children were warned not to wander near, lest the air cling to them as it had to the dead. The importance of the odor was not in its explanation but in its persistence. It became the only sensory evidence that something invisible, untouchable, had filled the dining room that night. The deaths were not caused by a weapon, not marked by wounds or disease, but by something breathed in, something present in the very atmosphere of their final supper. Whether chemical, natural, or otherwise, the effect lingered. Even days later, those who entered felt it coat their throats. The preacher left convinced that hunger had not killed the family, nor fever, but something carried in the air itself, metallic, thick as rain, oppressive and final. Of all the alterations made to the farmhouse in the weeks that followed, none spoke louder than the hearth. The kitchen, once the beating heart of survival, was bricked shut. The fireplace that had burned daily for decades was closed stone by stone until no ember could rise there again. What had once been the center of life became its grave. In rural Mississippi, the hearth was not symbolic, it was essential. It was the place of bread broth and warmth. To seal it was an act without precedent, and neighbors spoke of it in hushed tones. One visitor decades later recorded, "The bricks were laid tight as though to wall away not smoke, but a sickness." This was no repair. It was burial by hand. Inside utensils were left where they had fallen. An iron pot rusted through in damp silence. Wooden spoons warped and cracked. Shelves of jars once filled with beans and cornmeal stood uncapped, their contents devoured by insects and time. Nothing was cleared, nothing salvaged. The kitchen was abandoned in full as though the very objects had been poisoned. Children dared each other to peek in, but even the boldest refused to step across the threshold. Adults stayed away entirely. To them, the bricked hearth was not construction, it was containment. A sickness sealed within. Architectural historians would later note that such sealing was rare, reserved for plague rooms or condemned houses, never for a family kitchen. To brick over a hearth was to deny its purpose, to erase it from the living order of the home. The rest of the farmhouse remained in use. Its doors opened, its windows aired, but the kitchen was treated as infected ground. The symbolism unsettled later observers. Kitchens were meant to preserve life. To see one entombed in brick was to witness the community's verdict that the place of nourishment had betrayed them. Even in auction records decades later, the bricked hearth was listed not as a feature, but as a floor fireplace sealed no access. Prospective buyers recoiled. Few wished to own a house where the center of survival had been turned into a tomb. The property passed through reluctant hands, often abandoned the hearth, standing as both warning and monument. Dust thickened across the floorboards. Cobwebs filled the corners. The air grew dead, unmoving. No one stirred the pot again. No one lifted the spoons. The kitchen, once a place of daily labor, became a grave, not for bodies but for memory. The decision to brick it was irreversible. It was a burial in stone, an erasure as final as earth over a coffin. Like the silence of the cook, like the vanished ledger, the sealed hearth was its own testimony, mute but damning. After the bodies were lowered into the ground and the hearth entombed, all attention turned to the single survivor, the cook. She was summoned before local officials, though no trial was convened. Parish notes describe it as an informal examination held in a narrow side room of the courthouse. What remains of that session is sparse a few lines copied by a clerk and the silence that surrounded them. The officials pressed her with the simplest of questions. What had she served that night? Her answer, recorded without variation, was the same each time. I was told to serve, and I served. No elaboration, no defense, no confession. Just the same line repeated like stone. The words preserved in the record appear almost skeletal, copied without flourish. Their brevity leaving little room for interpretation. No list of ingredients, no notes on preparation, no defense of accident, and no admission of malice. She neither confessed nor denied. She simply anchored herself inside the narrow boundary of her duty. In that century, interrogations leaned less on evidence than on speech itself. Guilt was expected to reveal itself through trembling phrases, nervous elaborations, or sudden confessions. Silence was not neutral. It was treated as refusal and refusal as suspicion. One margin note added decades later by a weary clerk reads, "She said nothing more, as though she had been told that silence was safer than truth. The room where she sat is lost to time, but one can almost summon it. A wooden bench, a narrow window, bleeding light officials leaning forward, impatient. They wanted narrative, and she denied them narrative. In an age where testimony was often the only proof, silence itself became the heaviest weight she could bear. Her trace in the archive flickers once in the 1860 census, her name listed among the enslaved members of the household. After the deaths, it vanishes completely. She is absent in the records of 1870 in contracts in parish ledgers of marriage or burial. The disappearance is not gradual but absolute, as though her life was swallowed by the same void that claimed the family. Speculation has grown in that absence. Some whisper she was executed quietly, her end erased to spare scandal. Others suggest she was released, set adrift without property papers or acknowledgement. Her disappearance born not of conspiracy, but of neglect. Folklore insists she walked south toward the river and never looked back. The archives offer nothing. Her silence at questioning became mirrored by the silence of history. If she bore guilt, her silence preserved it. If she bore innocence, her silence denied her defense. Either way, she left nothing, and history returned the same. The ledger can record 11 deaths, but it cannot explain them. The interrogation can preserve one sentence, but not its meaning. Beyond that line, everything dissolves into blankness. It is in these blanks that suspicion takes root. Officials noted only that she would not answer further. The record closes as abruptly as it began. No trial, no sentence. She left the room, and in leaving it, she left the archive forever. What endures is the question: was her silence an admission of guilt or the last act of survival available to her? In Mississippi, the parish office served not just as archive, but as tribunal. Death itself did not exist in law until it was bound to ink by a clergyman's hand. Each passing was inscribed with ritual precision named date cause. Ledgers were both memory and law, mediating inheritance, burial rights, and the fate of the dead. Yet, when this family's deaths were recorded, the pen faltered. 11 names appear, each tied to the same date. But where the column should have carried a cause, fever flux, childbirth, accident, there is nothing. Or rather, there is something darker than omission. Ink pressed down so hard it buckled the page, blotting out whatever words had first been written. This was no careless error. To leave a blank was negligence. To strike through was intent. Such practices were rare, but not without precedent. suicide softened into fever, executions reduced to decline. But to plot out an entire household without replacement was an act of concealment beyond custom. Later readers turning pages by candlelight found only the outlines of names and a stain where explanation should be. The silence was not passive, it was deliberate, absolute. Clergy at the time balanced dual roles: shepherds of souls, scribes of civil order. To record 11 deaths without cause risked inquiry from physicians, magistrates, even military officials in a year already unsettled by war. Erasure may have been a shield, but who it was meant to protect remains uncertain. The family, the cook. The institution itself, some archivists studying the ink stains centuries later claimed faint letters beneath shadows of words like poison or mercury. But such readings are fragile, speculative at best, like seeing faces in wood grain. The record resists certainty just as its authors intended. The silence spread beyond the page. No sermons mentioned the tragedy. No service of mourning was given. The parish moved forward as though the family had been lowered into the earth without words to mark their passing. Institutional silence often outlasts truth. By striking through the column, the clergy did more than erase, they prevented questions from ever taking root. What was lost was not just record, but the possibility of inquiry. And yet, paradoxically, the ink spoke louder than any entry could have. Readers, centuries later, stare not at explanation but at the deliberate act of concealment. The absence becomes its own testimony, whispering that something lay beneath, too dangerous, too shameful to write. The tragedy ceased to be only a family's death. It became an institutional one. The mystery now was not only how 11 lives ended, but why the church chose silence. Who was being shielded from whom? Why here and why in this way? The hand that wrote the names was steady, but in striking out their end, it trembled into secrecy. After the ledgers were sealed and the cook herself vanished from the record, the farmhouse remained. Standing at the edge of a fallow field, its shutters drawn chimney, bricked it endured as a hollow shape. What once was a center of labor and sustenance became a boundary no one wished to cross. Neighbors avoided it. Children were warned away. The land lingered unsold in deed books, vacant a name without a family to hold it. Crops left uncut, withered to pale husks. Orchards dropped fruit that rotted at the base of trees, and animals wandered through unchallenged. It was not reclaimed by wilderness, but by stillness. Whispers carried what records denied. Curtains said to move, though no one lived within. Footsteps on the porch at dusk, but no figure visible. Prospective buyers claimed poor soil or distance from markets, but oral tradition recorded the truth no deed book could contain. No one wished to farm ground where an entire family had died in unison at their supper table. The silence of the ledgers seemed to seep outward, blanking not just the page, but the soil itself. Decay took on visible form. Shingles slipped loose, rain traced brown veins across ceilings. Hinges froze in rust, and swollen doors refused to open. In the bricked kitchen, soot spread like a second skin, its utensils collapsing slowly into orange rot. Furniture absorbed the scent of mold. And still nothing was cleared away. It was not poverty that left the rooms untouched, but fear. The house ceased to be property and became scar. Travelers along the river road spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it the house where the family died. They lowered their voices as they passed, as if sound alone might stir something inside. The story traveled beyond the parish, losing names but gaining weight. What remained was image, a house left hollow, its fields unfarmed, silence preserved like ritual. Surveyors decades later noted its strange persistence. While other houses fell burned or were rebuilt, this one was left to sag in place, too feared, to dismantle, too shunned to claim. Its endurance was not practical, but cultural. To touch it was to risk inheriting its silence. The abandoned structure became the one piece of evidence no ledger could erase. A landmark of unease, yet not all within stayed sealed. One object tied too closely to the night of the deaths returned, carrying the weight of memory, the dining table. When the farmhouse was finally cleared, most things were left to rot. In place, the bricked kitchen untouched, the upstairs rooms stripped to dust. But the table in the dining room remained impossible to ignore. Long and heavy, carved from oak, its surface darkened by years of meals, it was still solid, still capable of bearing weight. Estate handlers marked it as the only salvageable item of value. And so reluctantly, it was carried to auction. In the county record, it appears simply large dining table, wood stained. No clarification. Some assumed the mark was water damage, the trace of humidity. Others whispered the stain had bloomed on the night of the family's last meal, and no amount of scrubbing had ever erased it. Buyers touched the surface, then pulled their hands back. Few dared to take it home. Twice it sold. Twice it was returned within weeks. One man claimed the table warped the air of his dining room until meals went uneaten. Another swore the stain grew darker in candlelight, feeding on the flame. Neither account reached official record, but both survive in oral retellings whispered by descendants who would not touch furniture from that sale. The table became itinerant, passed hand to hand, never welcomed, never kept. By the third time, no auctioneer bothered with it. It was traded in private, exchanged for tools, left in barns where no one dared eat. Too large to ignore, too heavy to discard, wherever it stood, it dominated the room. Some swore it carried memory itself. The impression of chairs drawn close, of spoons lifted, of silence falling. To eat at it felt like trespass. Folklore transformed it into warning. Children were told never to sit at it, never to taste food from its surface. The superstition spread anyone who lingered too long at the table would taste iron on their tongue. Records fall silent after the 1880s. Some say it was chopped into firewood, though few believed anyone would risk burning such a thing indoors. Others whisper it still rests in a barn along the river, hidden under dust, waiting. The table outlived the family, but never found another family to serve. It became more than wood. It became symbol, the last surface they touched before death, the last witness to their supper. In auction rooms, in refusals, in whispered stories, it transformed into a cursed object that bore memory instead of use. And where the ledgers blotted out detail, the community filled the void with words of its own. Out of fragments, a phrase emerged that endured long after the house sagged into ruin. They ate together. They left together. It was not written in record books. It was not spoken from pulpits. It lived in porches, in fields by hearths. Parents whispered it to hush children, invoking the family's fate as warning. Farmers muttered it when passing the abandoned property, lowering their voices so as not to wake its memory. By the 1870s, collectors of folklore noted its presence in children's rhymes. One game chant ran, 11 bowls, 11 spoons. All fell silent in the room. They ate together. They left together. Beware the table's gloom. Never printed, but carried mouth to mouth, it gave dread without context. Field recordings from the early 20th century catch echoes of the line. In work songs, never as refrain, but as ornament a ghost threaded into rhythm. Meals, symbols of survival, could also bind themselves to death. The phrase endured because of its ambiguity. It named no cause, only the togetherness. It invoked no house, no cook. Yet it carried both. It became shorthand for endings too sudden, too complete. Some swore repeating it at midnight invited hunger into the home. Others claimed speaking it before supper turned curse into charm. Its power lay in permanence. Names faded. The house crumbled. But the phrase remained. And yet, every repetition circled back to the unspoken question. The family had eaten and left together. But why had the cook remained? The proverb closed the circle around the family, but left her outside it. Her silence, her survival, broke the pattern. 11 left, but 1 served and stayed. The last memory of the cook lingers not in paper, but in the quiet testimony of neighbors. They saw her walking alone along the riverbank after the tragedy, small against the wide current, carrying nothing, not even bread for her hands. She did not return to the house nor knock on another door. She simply moved downstream until the river swallowed her from sight. After that, the records fall silent. No contract, no grave, no marriage, no name. She vanishes as if she had never lived, leaving behind only the sound of water and the silence of her steps. And yet, her absence unsettled more than her presence ever did. Was her silence an act of protection or a confession left unspoken? Did she vanish by despair, or did something less nameable claim her? The truth never surfaced. When the dining table reappeared decades later, it carried its own ghost. 11 chairs pressed close, but one was always drawn back as though waiting. Some believed it belonged to the eldest son. Others swore it had been meant for a guest who never arrived. Whatever its origin, the empty chair clung to the story. Families who bought the table sent it away again, claiming food tasted of iron when served upon it, that conversations faltered into silence, that one seat in the room would always remain unfilled. The warning grew into folklore: never leave a chair pulled from a table overnight, or hunger itself will sit there. Children whispered it into rhymes, farmers muttered it under breath. The chair became not wood, but symbol, heavier than any ledger, stronger than any brick. And so the story returns to its beginning, the table. 11 ate, 11 were lost, 1 served, and 1 chair waits still, its emptiness more enduring than life. The parish chose silence. Records were struck through, the hearth was sealed, and the cook walked away, leaving no word, no trace, no grave, only the image of a figure fading downriver, carrying silence into history. What happened in that farmhouse may never be named. Was it accident, punishment, or something older? Something ritual? The chair does not answer. It only waits. Its silence heavier than any voice. If you believe the family's end was chance, share your thoughts below. If you believe it was something darker, tell us why. And before you close your eyes tonight, remember to subscribe to Sleepy History Tales, where stories others try to erase are spoken once more, case by case, name by name.